Hi, everyone. My name is Coco Sachs, and I'm a current senior at Bucknell University.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shorney, and I'm a current junior at Bucknell University. Over the past year, Coco and I have been researching the psychological impact of COVID-19 and social distancing on college students under the supervision of Professor Boyatzis from the psychology department. Today, we are going to be presenting some of our preliminary findings from our research.
Before explaining our methodology and preliminary findings of our study, it's important to consider the unique situation that COVID-19 has presented for college students across the country. Because of the pandemic, students' lives have been drastically changed. However, because we're still in the pandemic, there has been limited research on the psychological impact of this period of time. However, a recent study conducted at Clemson University by Browning et al. Suggests that sheltering in place as a result of COVID-19 has led to higher stress levels, higher worry, more negative emotion states, and preoccupation with COVID-19. As a result of these findings, it is imperative that more research is conducted on the psychological effects of this unprecedented era. So our study was conducted in order to add to the growing body of knowledge surrounding the subject.
So in order to study the psychological effects of COVID-19 on college students, we administered a virtual MTurk survey in the fall of 2020 to first-year students at Bucknell and examined how variables in the students' home quarantine environment predicted key outcome variables of students' loneliness and anxiety. We also included various other measures in the survey. However, today we will only be discussing preliminary findings on these variables. So for our methodology, we distributed a survey to the 118 Psych 100 first-year students at Bucknell through the Intro Psych Research SONA system. So this survey was open from the period from October to November of 2020, a 1-month period. The demographics of our participants, 71.2% of the students were female, 88% of the students identified themselves as Caucasian or white. The mean age of the students was 18.69, and almost all of the students were quarantined in their parents' home during this period. So on our Qualtrics survey, participants were asked to base their responses on their feelings in their quarantine environment from March to August 2020. So therefore, they were reflecting on their past experiences.
So to talk about our measures and the predictor and key outcome variables, we asked students to report the number of people in their quarantine environment, as well as rating their psychological safety based on a 7-point scale, 1 being strongly disagree and 7 being strongly agree. Additionally, we used the trust subscale of the IPPA and had students rate their level of trust with their father and mother separately to investigate the importance of parental relationships during this time period. A sample item from the IPPA: my father or mother doesn't understand what I'm going through these days. To measure loneliness, we utilize the UCLA 3-item loneliness scale, the sample item being, how often do you feel that you lack companionship? To measure anxiety, we use the GAD-7 generalized anxiety disorder scale, sample item being, how often do you feel anxious, nervous, or on edge? Finally, we computed Cronbach's alphas for each of our scales, and our values were all 0.85 or above.
So turning now to the results of our study, as shown in table 1 on the screen, we computed mean scores for all of our variables. So it's clear that based on these results, the students were generally low in both anxiety and loneliness, as seen through the mean scores of 2.12 out of 4 possible points, 1.88 out of 3 for loneliness. So students were also high in psychological safety with a mean of 5.69 out of 7 possible points, and trust in both parents, father and mother, with means of 4.21 and 4.5 out of 5 possible points.
We then conducted t-tests to determine if there were any significant differences between genders in regard to our variables. However, only one significant difference was found, which was the level of psychological safety. The average psychological safety score for our male participants was 5.95, which is almost a full point higher than the average for our female participants, which was 5.06, with a p-value of less than 0.01. So this indicates that males felt psychologically safer in their quarantine environment. However, as we've said before, both groups did indicate an overall general psychological safety score.
So next, we ran correlations to determine if there were any significant relationships among the variables that we investigated. So as shown in table 2 and as indicated by the asterisks, there were multiple significant relationships. So higher levels of anxiety were significantly correlated with higher levels of loneliness. Anxiety was inversely related with psychological safety, meaning that lower levels of anxiety were significantly related to higher levels of psychological safety. Anxiety was also inversely correlated with trust in father, meaning that lower levels of anxiety were related to higher trust levels in father for our students. Loneliness was inversely related to psychological safety and trust in both parents, meaning that lower loneliness ratings were related to higher levels of psychological safety and trust for our students. Higher levels of psychological safety were significantly correlated with higher levels of trust, specifically in the father. So finally, high levels of trust in the father were associated with higher levels of trust in the mother as well.
We then conducted regression analyses to determine which, if any, variables significantly predicted anxiety. Because loneliness accounted for a large portion of the variance in anxiety, we decided to leave this variable out in order to have a better understanding of our other independent variables. So collectively, psychological safety, number of people in quarantine environment, and trust in both parents predicted 15% of variance, which was significant at a p-value of less than 0.001. Additionally, psychological safety and trust in father were significant individual predictors of anxiety, with a p-value of less than 0.001 for psychological safety and less than 0.04 for trust in father. Interestingly, number of people in quarantine environment and trust in mother were not significant predictors of anxiety.
So we also conducted regression analyses to determine which, if any, of the variables significantly predicted loneliness. So in this case, anxiety accounted for a large portion of the variance for loneliness, just as loneliness did for anxiety, as Coco talked about just a second ago. Therefore, we determined that these two variables were indeed comorbid. And in this case, we chose not to include anxiety as an independent variable in our regressions for loneliness. So collectively, psychological safety, number of people in quarantine environment, and trust in both parents predicted 27% of the variance, which was significant as seen through the p-value. So once again, psychological safety was a significant individual predictor with a p-value equal to 0, and trust in both mother and father were also individual significant predictors of loneliness with a p-value of less than 0.05.
So now moving to our conclusions, again, we want to emphasize that these are the preliminary findings of a larger study, but our main conclusions right now include the following. In general, as we've said, our population was relatively low in anxiety and loneliness during their quarantine homestay. The number of people within their quarantine environments had no impact on anxiety or loneliness levels, which we found particularly interesting because we thought this kind of indicated a stronger emphasis on quality of relationships rather than quantity of relationships. Additionally, students' psychological safety was inversely related to their anxiety and loneliness and was correlated with a higher trust in both father and mother. Finally, higher psychological safety and higher trust in father predicted lower levels of anxiety and loneliness.
So while this study adds to the field of research focused on the psychological impact of COVID-19, there are various limitations to our study that must be considered when we're thinking about our findings. So the first year students that we surveyed were seniors in high school during their quarantine homestay. So perhaps they were more accustomed to living at home. This may have impacted their reporting of levels of anxiety and loneliness. And if we were to study students who were in college during the start of COVID-19, these reportings may have been different. So additionally, the demographics of our population may have impacted our results, given that 88% of our students identified as Caucasian. And as we talked about earlier during the introduction of our presentation, other studies have suggested that there are higher psychological impacts for marginalized groups, such as people of color. So in the future, we are planning to continue our analyses on other predictor and outcome variables, including ethnicity, body image, and disordered eating.
We'd like to thank Professor Boyatzis for supervising our research, and thank you to all of you who have listened, and we look forward to presenting our further findings in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.